Welcome to Business Edge. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. After 4 years and hundreds of witnesses, the Judicial Commission of Inquiry into allegations of state capture, corruption and fraud in the public sector, including organs of state, finally submitted its findings to South African President Cyril Ramaphosa. The Zondo Commission, as it's known, was set up to investigate allegations of corruption and fraud in the country's public sector. The third and final tranche of the inquiry marks the conclusion of a widely conducted probe into allegations of misappropriation and misdirection of public funds. The completion of the inquiry is just the beginning, as South Africans wait to see if actions and sanctions will follow. That conversation will be our first today on Business Edge, but up first is African Business Headlines. South African state power company Eskom said on Friday that electricity cuts could intensify following labor protests at 9 of its facilities linked to deadlocked wage talks. The utility, which has struggled to meet power demand in Africa's most industrialized nation for over a decade, has been implementing rotational outages since the start of the week that are due to last until Sunday night. Eskom said in a statement that the protest included incidents of intimidation of working employees and blocking of roads leading to power stations. Qatar's ruler will visit Egypt on Friday, his first trip to the country since Egypt and Qatar agreed last year to end a long-running regional feud. Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, who last visited Egypt in 2015, will hold a formal meeting with Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Cairo on Saturday. He met al-Sisi for the first time since the dispute at a summit in Iraq last year. Zimbabweans who held Zimbabwean exemption permits, which the South African government has now scrapped, are in anxiety and anguish as they face deportation, uprooting their lives and children and starting all over again in Zimbabwe, or continuing to live in South Africa as undocumented aliens. About 178,000 Zimbabweans are badly affected by the cabinet decision not to renew the Zimbabwe exemption permit, which expired in December 2021. The holders of that permit were given until the end of December 2022 to legalize their status in South Africa by other means. For most, this is not possible. The Helen Suzman Foundation's challenge to government's decision not to renew the permits is giving Zimbabweans some hope, but the many agitations against foreigners taking South African jobs has been on the rise. Harare and Pretoria have been quiet on this nagging issue with intense economic concerns. And still talking about permits and visas, new visa transit rules for Kenyan passengers connecting flights through the European Union are set to increase the cost of travel as international travel resumes. The Kenyan embassy in Paris issued a circular notifying Kenyan travelers to obtain transit visas before flying through the EU to other destinations in Europe. This means that an adult passenger for Kenya heading to the US via Amsterdam must pay 10,500 Kenyan shillings to the Dutch embassy in Nairobi or through its agents to obtain a Schengen transit visa. A Schengen visa is a short-stay permit that allows a person to travel to any member of the Schengen area for up to 90 days for tourism or business. With surging inflation and increased cost of living, the Nigerian middle class is finding itself losing the purchasing power required to stay within that class. A report by SB Morgan, which looks into the issue, blames the 2019 border closure policy, high import tariffs, petrol subsidy, and foreign currency exchange rate policy of the Central Bank of Nigeria for the pressure on the country's citizenry. All these factors, the report said, have combined to keep the country's inflation rate in double digits and essentially wiping out a large section of the country's middle class. And despite its tough economic climate, Ghana insists it will not approach the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. This is according to the country's Deputy Minister of Finance, John Kuma, who says the government has in place sufficient measures to alleviate the current economic challenges. He said the government is confident in its homegrown solutions in getting the economy to recover, adding that governments will keep introducing more measures to raise revenue domestically to sustain the economy. He did add that Ghana continues to enjoy the technical support and advice received from the IMF. And after more than 4 years, over 300 witnesses interviewed, and more than $60 million spent, the Zondo Commission has handed in the last of the 6-part findings to South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa. What are the implications of the report's findings, and what happens next? The conversation after the break. This is Business Edge. The Zondo Commission is the first time that an extensive inquiry will be done on the many years of fraud in the South African public sector. It was first set up by former President Jacob Zuma in January 2018, following the publication of a report by the leader of the opposition at the time, which implicated Zuma in several cases of corruption and graft. The scandal eventually cost him his presidency, but it didn't end there. Over the next 4 years, the Commission has uncovered extensive rot within the state, including mismanagement of state-owned enterprises like South African Airways, Eskom, Transnet, and others. The final report was submitted to the President this past week. The conclusion? It has become clear that corruption is deeply rooted in South Africa's public sector, and it is a major reason for the loss of faith in the system, as well as the decay in several public enterprises. What do we know about what is in more than 5,000 pages of findings, and will heads roll for what the Commission has found? Joining me is Sanusha Naidu. She's an author, academic, research specialist, and analyst at the Institute for Global Dialogue. Sanusha, thank you so much for joining me.
Good day, and thank you for the invitation to be on the show.
So let's just go a bit back, because for some people, 4 years is a long time, and for others, 4 years is not such a long time. So let's just quickly establish, in terms of the allegations that really kicked off what we now know as the Zondo Commission, what was former President Jacob Zuma implicated in at that time?
Well, it started off with a report that was done by the former public protector, Advocate Thuli Madonsela, looking into the former statesman's residence, private residence in KwaZulu-Natal called Nkandla. And in there was questions being raised about how much of money that came out of state resources that was used for upgrades for the former statesman's private residence. And that is really where the actual catalyst begins around the issue of state capture, or the issue of irregular expenditure of state resources for the former president's home. And it is in that context that the report that the former public protector had produced, and where she started to not delve into the kinds of issues that we see that were ventilated at the Zondo Commission, but rather it was her recommendation that there should be a commission of inquiry, which was quite interesting, because in that recommendation, the former public protector also noted that she felt that it should not have been a commission of inquiry that the former President Zuma should actually nominate the head of. It should be the Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court at the time, Mogoeng, who should actually oversee that. So I think what was interesting here was that the former president, he was a very implicated person at the time, and so this is really the roots of where the Zondo Commission starts. And I think when you look at the final tranche of reports that were handed over to President Ramaphosa in the week, you will note that Chief Justice Zondo makes that point about thanking former public protector Advocate Thuli Madonsela for setting this in motion.
All right, so things have been set in motion. We're 4 years down the line, and we'll get into some of the recommendations and, of course, now the widening scandal that has encompassed a lot of people. But state capture is a term that has now been popularized by South Africa's inquiry into this corruption and fraud. And you've established a little bit about what exactly state capture is. In terms of what it means for a country such as South Africa, what has state capture cost South Africa? What has it cost the citizens? It might be difficult for us to estimate in money terms, but it is coming at some kind of financial cost and some kind of even other costs to the country as well.
Indeed, I think, the quantification of what this means for us in South Africa can only be felt, I think, in the insert that you mentioned about the electricity outages that we've had. The real challenge, if you look at all of the volumes that have now been sent to the president, if you look at them, the real issue is corruption. How corruption happens, how corruption is orchestrated, how it's put into place, how people who are actually investigating this corruption and patronage networks, how they have had their lives being threatened. At some point, people having been assassinated. So it's a very deep-seated set of economic malfeasance and governance irregularities. But the real issue here is the impact on lives and livelihoods. So what we are seeing now is the lack of money that was invested in state infrastructure. Our railways are in a crisis. Our electricity generation is in a crisis. Our water and sanitation supplies are in a crisis. Everything is in a state of peril, and that is the real cost to people's lives and livelihoods. And the money that could have been used to build the infrastructure, maintain the infrastructure, create jobs and create opportunities for young people has also been absorbed by people who have been utilizing this money for private gain and for excessive greed.
So when we now look at that, you've talked about, of course, Eskom as an example of the situation that state capture has affected, has brought about in South Africa. But this particularly has spanned a number of public enterprises, including South African Airways. And we've talked about the massive amounts of bailout that the airline has received. It's also gone ahead to rail utilities, Transnet, also even the public broadcaster, and also gotten to Zuma, his cabinet, and the African National Congress. In terms of what it looks like, what do we know happened in some of these instances of where corruption and graft was part of the conversation?
So what happened is that in these SOEs, in particular the SOEs that were linked to the electricity sector, linked to the railway transport sector, as you mentioned, the public broadcaster, we're still debating whether it's a state or a public broadcaster, and that's a bit of a gray area, but we can see what has happened there is. And as well as in state security agency. A lot of that was about how did you capture the boards on those agencies. So you mentioned SAA and the bailouts that SAA has been given by the state. But what is important is the way in which you manage who gets onto the boards and who actually then ventilates and approves the cost and the budgeting of the SOEs, and how much of that subcontracting of money goes to patronage networks. And this is where the Gupta family comes in, because they had this very, very unhealthy and toxic relationship with the state at the time, and they were trying to influence who were going to be ministers, who was going to be on the boards, and the real issue is really around where is the money. And right now, I think what the Zondo Commission report in the final volume show us is that the money was in the state-owned enterprises, and this is where state-owned enterprises needed to be captured. And I think that is perhaps why it is so important as well to look at the final volume, and in particular where the Chief Justice mentions that President Ramaphosa could have done better in terms of dealing with the deployment of ANC members into cabinet, but also onto boards, and how that created the kind of open season for capturing money, etc. Let me give you a small example. Under COVID-19, there were tenders that went out for protective private equipment. Those PPE tenders were for non-medical supplies. And that we have regulatory frameworks that the National Treasury puts into place that says these are the things that need to be complied with in terms of a state tender. But because it was an emergency, that was all kind of overlooked. And now then we see that the former health minister was involved in some of those contracts that were illegally given to a company that he has close ties to. And that's just a simple drop in the ocean. When you multiply that in the context of the commission and the report and the evidence and the final recommendations, you can see how much of that has been essentially captured in terms of where the money was. And you're talking, just as you said, if the Zondo Commission costed about $60 billion US, we're thinking that the actual cost of how much of money that was stolen is probably 10 times that at a minimum.
So I have to ask this question because the Zondo Commission was investigating former President Jacob Zuma, who had President Cyril Ramaphosa as his vice, and who at one time was actually vice to a former president as well. So you sort of see that there's a circle here, or whether involved in government, there's a timeline here. So if you were to ask the Zondo Commission to go further back, the question would then become, is this only an issue that is of the Zuma generation, of the Zuma administration and further down, or can we now say at this point in time that we're looking at corruption and graft being an endemic issue in South Africa?
I think you raise a very valid point, because I think the point that you are raising is, does this issue of corruption, nepotism, patronage networks, capture of contracts, and so forth, does it only start in the context of where the terms of reference are for the Zondo Commission inquiry? And that is because the advocate Thuli Madoselo's terms of reference was very narrow in that sense. It started at that point. But for many of the analysts in South Africa, we would agree, sometimes broadly, sometimes more specifically, that the issue of corruption extends further than this. That if you look at the arms deal, and this is the other issue that needs to be mentioned, that former President Zuma also has the arms scandal and the arms deal question coming up in the courts, I think later this year, and he's been trying to maneuver away from that, making all kinds of litigation applications to try and get the prosecutor off the case, and saying that the prosecutor is biased towards him, and so forth and so forth. So this kind of question that you raise actually probably extends even further than just what we are seeing under the Jacob Zuma years in presidency. But I think the challenge is also that we had a very limited time reference in terms of the terms of what the Zondo Commission could look at. And I suspect that if we're going to go further back from 2014, etc., further back to 2009 and further back to 2002, I think we're going to end up in a situation where the South African public is just really, really angry about how much of money that could have been used for people's lives and livelihoods, and how much of the cost and the burden is on the shoulders of the South African citizen. They're just going to get more angry. And right now, South Africans, the public is just in a very apathetic and very distrustful of government.
All right, Sanusha, we're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to touch base. You have mentioned the Thegupta brothers, but let's look at what empowered them, because there are agencies of government that are meant to flag these situations, and then also look at the recommendations. Jacob Zuma, former president, has a number of cases against him. What happens now, given the recommendations from the Zondo Commission? So the conversation will continue on Business Edge as we look at the Zondo Commission submitting the final tranche of its report to President Cyril Ramaphosa, who himself was mentioned because of how the Commission believes he failed to act in the best interest of South Africans. The conversation after this. My guest is Sanusha Naidu. She's an author, academic, research specialist, and analyst at the Institute for Global Dialogue as we look at the Zondo Commission submitting its final report. Sanusha, let me bring you back now. So the Zondo Commission has recommended the prosecution of a wide-ranging number of officials, ranging from former heads of state companies to government ministers, and also an overhaul of the appointment processes and managerial controls. Do you think this will happen? Let's start there.
I think it's a tall order. I think the recommendation that the Chief Justice makes in the final report to suggest that there are implicated persons, senior members who are in cabinet that should face the letter of the law, has also been quite a disturbing set of issues, because these members in parliament or in cabinet are holding very key portfolios. One of them, who may be seen as a key ally in the ANC of the top six, is the Minister for Mineral and Resources. And I think this is something that we've got to be careful of in terms of saying, well, if you want to show your hand and say that you're taking corruption seriously and anti-corruption and anti-graft seriously, then you've got to have some kind of level of criminal prosecution. And that's where I think the Zondo Commission's terms of reference were limited as well, because it didn't have prosecutorial authority. It did not have the powers to prosecute, and therefore it's highlighting that there are a number of avenues where our security class, our judicial cluster, the National Prosecuting Authority, the Asset Forfeiture Unit, the Hawks, which is an investigative agency, all have to start now putting together a cohesive, coherent approach and start investigate further so that they have the evidence to take on a criminal set of procedures. This is going to raise a much deeper set of questions, but it's also going to procrastinate in terms of how long will this legal route take in terms of putting the evidence together, getting the kinds of criminal dockets and the kind of documentation that enables a criminal docket to be open and so forth. And then, of course, there's the question of those that are implicated and have been told that they need to be prosecuted. They have the right of appeal. So we're already going to see this going forward. And I think the problem here is that we've just finished a very long process and very deep evidence, which has been quite disturbing. And now we're going to have to go through the process of implementation, and that's going to be even longer. And if you listen to the president on Tuesday evening when he was receiving the report, the question was posed to him by one of the reporters asking, where do we go now? And what are you going to be doing? And he says, well, he's going to follow due process. He's going to now take these reports, the final tranche of reports, together with the previous tranches, and present them to Parliament. Parliament then has to make a decision. There's a due process here. So I think we are a bit far off, in my opinion, and I could be wrong, but my assessment is that we are a bit far off, if not even more far off than where we should be in terms of prosecutions, criminal cases being lodged against the implicated ministers and other people in the ANC.
And even sanctions and actions.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, even the ANC's own step-aside rule is causing a lot of controversy, and people are not interpreting it in the way that it should. So I think we're in for a very long road. It may even extend quite long over the 2024 election period.
That's something that I'm very sure many people would not want. So let's talk about some of the major players at the center of this. And the brothers, Rajesh and Thegupta, were recently arrested. And many believe that just simply their arrest could be a turning point in South Africa's fight for corruption. But I think the larger question at play has been, how have they been able to do what they did for so long? It's not just them. There are, of course, other minor players, but the Gupta brothers are a symbol in this conversation around state capture for South Africans. Where were the agencies that should have red flagged some of the managerial process issues? Where were the agencies that should have been overlooking the funds? Where were South Africa's control and monitoring agencies in the time that state capture was happening?
The short answer to your question is they were not there, or they overlooked it, because at the end of the day, when you actually piece together the narrative that comes out of the Zondo Commission's report, you kind of get the sense that there was a undue influence to say overlook these things. And I think your question is, it's not just about the fact that the infamous Gupta family is synonymous with state capture and corruption in South Africa. I think the question, as you rightly ask and legitimately ask, is that why was this allowed to happen? And I think the point being is that the agency, and I use agency more in terms of how much of implementation and using the oversight of our institutions to ensure that this never reached the point that it reached, as we see now, is that they just were not there to do what they were supposed to do. They could have, there are intimations and there are speculations and there are conspiracy theories that suggest that they were asked to basically turn a blind eye to this, that the Gupta family were able to come in and do what they did because they were given the opportunity to do it, that nobody was willing to pull back. I mean, if you listen to the evidence of, say, Malusi Gigaba, or if you listen to the evidence of his wife, which I think was even his ex-wife, rather, which was even more interesting than the evidence he gave, is just how much of influence this family had, because the agencies, the South African government, those that were in the cabinet, in the authority at the time, just said, well, it's okay. And it's not just the Gupta family. They gave away their agency to the Gupta family. But what is also interesting is the former company that Gavin Watson headed, which is now called Africa Global or something. It was basically a company that got the contracts and the airport security and all kinds of infrastructure. I mean, there too, there was just a complete lack of integrity, if I can use that word, to say that we can't do this because people need money we need to basically build the resources, the economic and the political and the governance architecture. We need to make sure this economy is stronger and strengthened and able to absorb the structural constraints and so forth. But people just didn't give a damn. And I'm sorry to be that blunt. And I think that that's what it is. It was about selfishness, it was about vested interests, and it was about people's own personal
gain.
Wealth.
Okay, so is there a figure to this? Because as we talked about, we know the term state capture. We know a lot of the major players like the Thegupta brothers, the former president as well, ministers of his cabinet as well, and even in some way this current president. Do we have a figure to the money that was somehow mismanaged, misappropriated, moved, that was defrauded from the South? There's no figure. You're shaking. There's no amount.
I'm shaking my head because I think when you want to quantify it within a figure, we're not realizing the qualitative impact that it's had. So if you want to quantify a figure, if we thumbsuck a figure and we say, my benchmark is if the Commission of Inquiry cost $60 billion US, what was the value of corruption and capture that took place? And you can calculate it at 10 times that amount, 20 times that amount. I don't think we actually understand the volume in terms of what the quantitative figure is. But for me, it goes deeper than that because it actually has broken the system. It's broken the institutions. It has made these institutions inoperable, unable to govern themselves. And that is a bigger figure than just getting a number out there.
All right, Sanusha, we'll end the conversation now, but I know there's a lot more because even as you say that this inquiry has broken the system, there are those who wonder if after 300 plus witnesses, over 5,000 pages, over 1 billion rand spent, has it been worth it? And can South Africa make it worth it for the population? You talked about the timeline, that it might just take a bit longer. We might be looking at the next 4 to 5 years and the implications for this. So let me just ask you this as I let you go, and I hope you can give me an answer in 1 minute. Eventually, do you think that the Zondo Commission and everything that comes from it will be worth it for South Africa?
I think it is worth it. I think it gave us an incredible eye-opener to what was going on. I think we're feeling very, very jaundiced at the moment as a nation because we hear how much of money was stolen, and yet the livelihoods of people still remain so undesirable and poor and living below the poverty line and inequality. But I think that what's going to be important is that this Commission of Inquiry report has opened up the doors to say, we will hold you always accountable. And I think that's something that we can take away from this report, that in spite of everything else, it did show us to a large extent that our state was captured and that we are now open to the idea that the transparency and accountability does work. And of course, South Africans, when they go to vote, they'll bear that in mind.
Okay, Sanusha, thank you so much. A conversation I look forward to continuing with you as we hear more about what is inside the report. Thank you and have a great day. And it is one that has far-reaching consequences. And as I said, state capture has become a phrase popularized by the situation in South Africa, but it's also made a number of other Africans look inwards to what's happening inside their own countries. You're watching Business Edge. Up next is International Business Headlines. Stay with us. And let's get you some international business stories before we continue the show. UK Chancellor Rishi Sunak borrowed another £14 billion last month as national debt interest payments hit £7.6 billion amid rocketing inflation, the highest for any May on record. The figures from the Office for National Statistics show that surging levels of inflation sent interest payments on government debt to a record-breaking £7.6 billion. That's £3.1 billion higher than a year earlier. That means interest payments on the UK national debt jumped by 70% compared with the year before. Consumer confidence in Britain has fallen to its lowest level since records began in 1974 as a stark new economic reality hit households. Figures show JFK's long-running consumer confidence index dropped 1 point to minus 41 in June, setting a new record low for a second successive month, while confidence in personal finances over the next 12 months fell 3 points to minus 28 points. And let's move on to the next story. India's central bank is on course to bring down prices, but the retail inflation rate is likely to remain above the top end of its mandated target band until December. And this is coming from the bank's governor. The governor said despite current inflation being driven by supply side factors, monetary policy still plays an important role when inflation rises, since household price expectations are backwards looking. Oil prices have traded sideways on Friday after briefly rising nearly $1 per barrel as the market balanced fears of slower demand from cooling U.S. economic activity with supply uncertainty. Brent crude futures were trading down 5 cents or 0.1% at $110 a barrel by 300 GMT, while U.S. WTI crude futures were up 19 cents to $104.46 a barrel. Prices fell around 1.5% in the previous session. And finally, the Capital Market Authority of the Sultanate of Oman has decided to adopt a new approach to calculate the solvency margin of insurance companies on the audited financial statements of 2022. According to the CMA, their decision to switch to a risk-based approach was made to protect the rights of policyholders and ensure sustainable performance. The risk-based approach measures the amount of insurance companies' capital to support its business in light of the risk exposure, which varies from one company to another. And now we'll get into our next conversation, which takes us to Kenya at this time, where the World Bank has shown an interest in Kenya's debt status. Now, Kenya's debt profile has continued to rise, both in loans taken and in the volume of debt servicing. This year alone, the country will spend 1.39 trillion shillings, around $12.1 billion, on debt servicing. Its total debt obligations, some $72 billion. However, the World Bank has shown that it's interested in Kenya's economic recovery and future well-being, as it has stepped in to shield it from excessive loans by providing intervention loans of its own. Dr. XN Iraki of the University of Nairobi, Kenya, an economist, joins me now to talk about this. Dr. Iraki, welcome once again. Thank you for joining me on Business Edge.
Hello, good afternoon from a cold morning in Nairobi.
And it's a cold one here in some parts of Lagos as well. So let's look at this. In terms of the 2020 to 2021 COVID pandemic and its effect on African economies, there was a spread of some risk and, of course, easing in the restrictions happening as well. But Kenya has set aside time for economic recovery. Since the restrictions have been eased and since the spread of the COVID-19 has reduced, have we seen that economic recovery actually start?
Yes, if you check, if you walk on the streets of Nairobi or you go to the Kenyan countryside, there's evidence of some economic recovery once the restrictions were lifted. You no longer see people wearing masks and people can move from one part of the country to another. It's only that because of the fear of the sixth wave, the government has come back with restrictions telling us that we have to put on masks in public places. But all over there has been good signs of the economy recovering. One of the indicators is the rise in prices because of ensuring demand for goods and services. And if you talk to people on the street, people in the capital market, they have been very bullish about the recovery, except that the other indicators like what has happened in Ukraine, and that is damping our spirits.
Okay, so in terms of that recovery, we've had conversations about the debt that Kenya and other African countries have carried. But that debt for Kenya is not particularly as high. It's not as high as Egypt or South Africa and even 5 other countries. It's actually ranked 6th. When it comes to Kenya's debt, is that necessarily a bad thing? Are we right to be concerned, or that concern is just too early?
I think if I look at the Kenyan debt as a percentage of GDP, is probably about 70%, which is not as bad as other countries. So I think Kenya's debt is not bad compared to other countries, and as long as debt is put into the right use, I have no problem with it. So the reason why the Kenyan government is borrowing is to invest in infrastructure. If you drive around Nairobi and other cities, you'll find that the roads have improved, we have a strategic gauge rail, we're improving our ports, and a lot of other infrastructure. So if we can improve the productive capacity of the economy by taking debt, I think I have no problem with that debt, as long as it is put to the right use.
Kenya seems to enjoy a really good relationship right now with international financial institutions. The World Bank and the IMF, they've both helped Kenya to accumulate about $3.3 billion US in debt since the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. But Kenya has also been helped along, and some are worried about that. So let's look at this. The World Bank's particular interest in Kenya's economic well-being, where do you think that comes from?
In the last 1 or 2 years, the Kenyan public has been complaining about rising debt burden and how we are going to pay it back. So because of that complaint, which is political and sometimes economic, most people, the political leaders or the leaders in this country have come to World Bank, which gives interest at a lower rate, concessional rate. So if we can get more money from the World Bank, more money from IMF at a lower interest rate, then we can reduce the debt burden. The only concern with that is that people feel that we are going to be too much influenced by the Bretton Woods institutions. Yet, during Kibaki's era, which lasted for about 10 years, we had almost weaned ourselves off from IMF and other Bretton Woods institutions. So that's a concern.
But do you think it's normal to see so much concession? I don't know if it's so much we call it, but the concessions that the World Bank has been willing to make to Kenya, are those normally made to other countries?
I think they are made normally to highly indebted countries, but I think the government can negotiate with the World Bank, can negotiate with the IMF to get such concessional rates if it can be able to pay, if it is able to satisfy the conditions that are given by the World Bank or IMF or other multilateral organizations.
So before I let you go, let's quickly touch on the Eurobond situation. Now, Kenya had planned a sale of about 115 billion shillings Eurobond, but it scrapped it, saying that the surging yields were described as not feasible. And this also mirrors the decision that Nigeria took as well for its own. So when we see the conversation around particular Eurobonds for African countries now, and in particular Kenya, what do you think is happening?
If you remember the last 1 month or so, a lot of countries have raised the interest rates. UK, US, I think even Australia, and a few other countries. And the reason why they are raising the interest rates is to try and tame inflation. But when you raise the interest rates, it means that any money borrowed from those countries has very high interest rates and becomes a burden. And I think it's because of those very high interest rates, the government of Kenya has decided that interest rate, that debt burden from Eurobond is too high, and has decided to put it on hold until the interest rates are more manageable or more friendly. And I guess Nigeria did the same.
All right. And of course, we're all looking to see more economically healthy and viable economies. Professor XN Iraki, thank you as always for joining me. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you and have a good afternoon.
All right. And when we come back, we'll be wrapping things up, but not before we give you Stock Market Watch and we look at how the NGX, that's the Nigeria Exchange Limited, has transactions which have hit 1.51 trillion naira in 5 months. And of course, we also have NC4 to watch. This is Business Edge. Stay with us. And let's wrap things up by giving you a few stories we're keeping our eyes on. We start with this, where the European Union held a vote on Thursday considering a new report that would revive EU-Africa trade agreement. In the paper, more equitable treatment of African nations within the context of their existing bilateral trade agreements is advocated, which has been now forwarded to the European Commission for deliberation and, if necessary, resolution. South African state power company Eskom has said on Friday that electricity cuts could intensify following labor protests at 9 of its facilities linked to deadlocked wage talks. The utility, which has struggled to meet power demand in Africa's most industrialized nation for over a decade, has been implementing rotational outages since the start of the week that are due to last until Sunday night. Tunisian police arrested former Prime Minister Hamadi Jabali, who is also a former senior member of the Ennahda Islamist Party, on suspicion of money laundering. A statement by his family says that the police in the city of Sose seized Jabali's phone and his wife's phone and have now taken him to an unknown location. And finally, a court in the Democratic Republic of Congo has acquitted President Felix Tshisekedi's former chief of staff for embezzlement. his lawyer said, which this now overturns the most high-profile public corruption conviction in Congolese history. Vital Kamerhe was convicted in 2020 of embezzling $48 million earmarked for social housing and sentenced to 20 years. That was later reduced on appeal to 13 years before he was granted provisional release in December, pending further appeals. And it's a wrap on Business Edge for today and for this week. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget, at 11 a.m. West African time, Monday through Friday, we put African business, the economy and finance front and center. And we do it right here on News Central. At the top of the 12 o'clock hour, West African time, you have News Central Now, which gives you the latest news and information from here on the continent. On behalf of the team, I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. Do have a good one.